Okay, well, we're waiting on just a few more. I think Kate is going to send out a quick poll. We just want to take a quick moment to get a little bit more information about who all is joining us this afternoon. So if you don't mind taking a second to answer this quick poll for us, and then we will get started here in just a second. All right. Thank you so much to those of you who have filled out the poll. It'll be open for a little while longer. Again, this is just to give us a little bit more information about who's joining us this afternoon. But just for the sake of time, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Keller Young. I am an assistant research scientist at the Iowa Reading Research Center,
And I am
and I am
Seth
joined
King.
today by Dr. Seth King.
Mhm.
Go ahead.
Well, we're still working on our rapport, ladies and gentlemen, but I am Seth King, and I'm a PhD and a research fellow at the Iowa Reading Research Center. Back to you, Keller.
No, you are good. We are going to talk
All
today about the science of reading and fidelity, observing explicit instruction. And Seth is going to kick things off for us.
right. So what you've just seen is sort of the introduction, and what we're going to do now is just do a little background on explicit instruction. And so one question sort of that no doubt burning a hole is this idea of why we would even do that. So let's just explain that for a little bit. First, as many of you know, there are a lot of reading assessments nationally that consistently show that many students struggle with reading, and that even though we have a lot of debates about what kind of instruction we should use, a lot of the evidence does suggest that for readers who struggle with topics, the best thing to use is clear, structured guidance. This is not to say that unstructured sort of instruction where we let students explore material doesn't have a place. It certainly does. But when you're dealing with students who have sort of demonstrated needs in a content area, oftentimes we want to start from a more sort of guided, structured place. So when we use explicit instruction with fidelity, which means we're using it as it's designed and intended, it is often associated with positive outcomes in many areas. That includes reading, that includes writing, that includes math. So you put all that together, that's why we're talking about explicit instruction today and why we certainly hope you'll consider using it. Which brings us to the next part, which is what is explicit instruction? So when we talk about explicit instruction, we are going to be referring to a process that consists of five specific components. So first, it involves segmenting complex skills. Then it involves highlighting important elements of the performance that you want to see. After that, the third step involves systematically fading support for instruction. Once that support is faded, you want to make sure that you're providing frequent opportunities for rehearsal with feedback. And finally, you want to make sure that the student has an opportunity for independent practice. So a lot of people have an idea of what explicit instruction is, but we have a very sort of clear and specific idea of what that means when we say explicit instruction. There are some challenges with explicit instruction. First of all, many core reading programs lack elements of explicit instruction. And schools often struggle to monitor and maintain implementation fidelity, which potentially reduces the impact of evidence-based interventions. Now, we at the IRC have talked a lot about what implementation fidelity is in some of our other videos and modules, so we encourage you to take a look at those once you're done with this one. To address the learning needs of students, resources, training, observation tools, and coaching are needed to ensure that effective practices like explicit instruction are implemented with fidelity. All right, so we said that explicit instruction, you need to implement that with fidelity. So what does that actually mean? Let's talk about that. So what is fidelity? Fidelity is the extent to which an intervention has been implemented as intended. So one of the things that we're going to be doing in this webinar is talking about how you can support instructional coaches and administrators in conducting fidelity observations related to explicit instruction. But I want to point something else out here. Even if you're not an administrator or a coach, you could still use this because maybe you don't know what explicit instruction is. One of the best ways to learn how to do something is to actually get a look at how it's evaluated, right? So even if you're planning on using this in your practice, you've been thinking, my administrator has been telling me to use explicit instruction, even if you don't think that you're ever going to have a fidelity observation. The content of this presentation and the related website is something that you can use to think about how you're using explicit instruction in your practice. So when you're observing explicit instruction, something else to note is that it is sort of what I would consider content agnostic, meaning you can use it in a variety of lesson types, instructional relations, or instructional arrangements, and content areas. Okay, so it's very flexible to accommodate specific interventions and instructional arrangements. You can use this in peer-to-peer or group instruction. The usefulness of explicit instruction, combined with the challenges with adequate implementation fidelity, have inspired a lot of researchers to create a framework for consistently observing and monitoring components of explicit instruction. We're going to show you one of those frameworks today. All right, so what's that framework? We're going to review a specific fidelity rubric. And as we go through this, I do want to point out that we do have a module that covers this in a lot of detail. So if as I'm going along, you're thinking, where can I get more? You can certainly get more from the IRRC website. Okay. So there were a team of researchers, Johnson and colleagues, that developed a rubric to evaluate implementation fidelity of explicit instruction in various instructional domains. So what they've done is they've divided explicit instruction into 7 components. And then across those 7 components, you can evaluate whether or not it's not there, partially implemented, or implemented as intended. Okay. What's nice is that this rubric that we're showing you has actually been demonstrated to be an effective and reliable tool for observing explicit instruction and guiding coaching. All right. So if you're rating people using this, there are a lot of research, there's research that you can refer to let you know that, oh, what I'm doing makes sense. I can use this to guide improvement. So the measure first rubric, which we've developed that's aligned with the EI rubric that we're going to be talking about today, has taken those 7 sections and condensed them into 4 for clarity and usability. So these components include a total of 25 observable items are included within the measure first tool. Each component captures an important aspect of explicit instruction and, when scored, provides information on whether explicit instruction was implemented with fidelity. So the order and item numbers have been changed slightly because we want to make this as usable as possible. But for the most part, these components are pretty much the same thing that were featured in research. So if you're using our rubric, you can rest assured that it's fairly valid and reliable. In the following slides, we're going to unpack the best practices for observing each of these items using a research-based observation rubric. For those of you who are new to explicit instruction and in the use of this rubric, we recommend practice and training with the section before conducting observations.
I'm just going to hop in for just a second here, which
Please
is
do.
Just in case this is maybe your first Iowa Reading Research Center webinar and you're like, what is Measure First? Measure First is sort of our suite of materials that are designed to support fidelity of implementation practices in schools. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that, that is all available on our website under our resources tab. So that is Measure First, including kind of components of fidelity, and then this dives quite a bit deeper into explicit instruction. We're going to show you some materials, which I'm going to go ahead and put this link up, which is going to get dropped in the chat by our lovely kind of moderators this afternoon. And this is also available on our website to you as well. So would encourage you to maybe hop over to the IRRC website and kind of follow along there as well as we go through this rubric and the items and sort of what that implementation might look like. So thanks,
And be
Seth.
careful once you go there. There's so much stuff over there. It's easy to get lost and fall down a lot of different rabbit holes. So we encourage that. So you might start going for explicit instruction, but later you fall into this idea of Clifter or other resources that we have for handwriting and so on. So please go to the IRC website if you want to know more about this or a lot of the other stuff that we've touched on. Moving along. So when we talk about the first rubric component, goals and alignment, we're going to talk about 6 specific items that indicate how lesson objectives are defined, communicated to students, and incorporated into instruction. So this component also includes items related to how the materials and instruction that occur throughout the lesson align with the goal. So the first thing that you're going to want to do when the first item relates to explicitly stating the objective. So, what is this lesson about? What are we trying to do? And it's not enough to just state it. You want to make sure that it is stated in a way that students can understand it, and that it also describes the exact skills that the students are going to learn in that lesson. To the greatest extent possible, you also want to make sure that it avoids vague language and includes details on what students will do during the course of that lesson. Moving on to the next section. Items 3 and 4 talk about first the relevance of the goal. And so what this means is that you're telling the students why the goal matters. What are the connections between what students will learn and to the real world or future learning, right? So we've got to make it matter to the learner. Okay, what am I doing? And then item 3, why that matters. Once you've talked about that, you want to make sure that throughout the lesson, your instruction is aligned with your goals. Okay, so if an activity you're planning doesn't relate to the objectives that you've stated, then you might want to move that activity somewhere else. Okay? The idea is that we want to make sure that we've defined our goals and that everything we're doing serves those goals. Moving along to items 5 and 6, we also want to make sure that materials and examples that we're using align with our goals. So if you're observing this, the idea is to assess whether lesson materials and examples align with what the teacher said they'd be doing during the lesson. This item often requires a consideration of both materials and examples. So if materials such as a graphic organizer are used, they need to be selected so that they purposefully align to the goal. Selected examples you use during the demonstration portion of a lesson also have to align to that goal. Item 6 talks about whether or not examples and materials align with most or all students' instructional levels. And I can't really overstate the importance of this. So when we talk about reading or many other subjects, we talk about making sure that your materials are aimed at students. There's an instructional level, there's a frustrational level, okay? We need to make sure that the things that we're using in a lesson are things that aren't too easy, but also aren't too difficult, all right? And so this is something that you can determine simply by walking around the room and seeing how many of the students are able to engage with this over the course of the lesson. Some tips for observing. And so we want to point this out because observing is always something that is sort of a unique sort of endeavor. And so we want to provide some things here. You might understand what each item is asking you to do, but there are going to be some different implications based on what you're doing. Okay, so determining whether or not you're hitting items 1 through 3, that's going to be pretty easy because most of that is at the top of the lesson. So, did they state the goal? Well, they're supposed to do that up front. So, you know if they've done it or not. It gets a little bit more complicated as you go throughout the lesson. Okay, so it may be helpful to record the lesson goal when the teacher states it and then to refer to it throughout the observation because you're going to have to make sure that each activity that the teacher is doing aligns with that goal as they move forward. Okay, so you're not going to be able to just see items 4 through 5 one time. That's something that a teacher is going to have to keep in mind over the course of the design and execution of the lesson. Item 6 is something also that's going to require a lot of circulation and sort of monitoring. To accurately determine alignment of materials with instructional levels, you got to make sure that you're moving through the room and confirming whether materials are appropriate for most of the students who are in that lesson. Now we're going to move on to teaching procedures, which consists of 7 items related to the demonstration of a new skill or task. So the items in this component include explicit procedures used by teachers to relate previous learning to the current lesson and demonstrate targeted skills. So item 7 requires observers to determine whether the teacher activates students' background knowledge prior to introducing new instruction. So this provides an opportunity for students to consider what they already know about the topic or lesson, as well as remind them of any pre-taught skills they will need to complete the assigned task. So activities to activate background knowledge can take a variety of forms depending on the content, skills, and types of lessons. So sort of the KWL type activity at the beginning of a lesson is one way that you might prompt students to think about what they already know about something before they begin. Observers should also examine whether the teacher models the skill or task clearly and accurately. Modeling should demonstrate what proficient performance looks like and sounds like, including all necessary steps students will be expected to complete independently. The goal of modeling is to provide students with a clear example of successful task completion before they attempt to the skill on their own. And so this is sort of one way that we differ. You might be familiar with lessons that sort of give students an opportunity to get things wrong. Like, I'm going to ask you to do something, see how you do it, and then correct you. In explicit instruction, we tend not to do that. What we do instead is go, here is the task, here is how it's performed correctly. All right, so that's one of the ways that we separate explicit instruction from less structured procedures. For items 9 and 10, for 9, the teacher needs to provide an adequate number of demonstrations. So based on the complexity of a task, you may need to provide more demonstrations of what correct performance looks like. If there is a lot of sort of variance in terms of what constitutes an example of a correct answer versus what doesn't, that's where you're going to have to break things down repeatedly to help students really understand the nuance of the task. Demonstrations may include many different examples or repeated modeling of specific tasks before students engage in independent or guided practice. And throughout, you also want to make sure that you're using clear and precise language. Okay, so when you're saying this is what a task looks like when it's correct, the student has to make sure that they understand, or that rather, the teacher needs to make sure that it's really clear what the student needs to do to have an accurate completion of the task. Moving on to items 11 and 12. The teacher breaks down a new skill into discrete steps. So observers should look for evidence that the teacher provides scaffolding when needed to support student learning. So scaffolds can be things like prompts, cues, visual supports, or guided questioning. These supports help students successfully engage with new content and should be adjusted or faded as students demonstrate increased understanding and independence. A related item is 12, which is we're breaking this down into chunks that the student can manage. The more complex strategies are, the more the teacher should consider breaking them down into manageable units. So chunking tasks into logical steps helps address cognitive overload, processing demands, and working memory limitations. Teachers can break complex tasks across multiple steps within a lesson or across lessons. So don't feel that you have to go through an entire task in one lesson. If we're dealing with something very complicated, we can maybe do the first half in its own lesson and then move on to the second half later on. Some tips for observing this. So some of the included items may be implemented only at the beginning of the lesson. On the other hand, some items will need to be implemented throughout the lesson, such as the use of clear and precise language. Additionally, modeling may need to be implemented more than once, such as breaking the model down into bite-sized manageable chunks or modeling non-examples to help support student understanding. So it's really kind of important to take into account the context of what's actually being taught when you're looking for these elements of explicit instruction.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Seth. I'm going to go through our two other sections of the rubric and take us through the rest of this presentation. But Seth, interrupt me anytime. So next, we're going to go through the guided practice monitoring and feedback component. And within this component of the rubric, we have 6 items. And this is really where we start observing students as well as teachers, even more kind of explicitly, to make sure that we're seeing students get the opportunity to practice, kind of that the teacher is monitoring the students' progress and providing appropriate feedback. So we're really observing the students as they're practicing their skills and or strategies, and making sure that the teacher's providing timely and specific feedback. So item 13, in item 13, we are again talking about scaffolding. So here we're seeing the teacher systematically withdraw support. And often we'll see this follow kind of a most to least prompting sequence. And by that, we mean that the teacher is kind of initially providing pretty intensive support and then gradually reducing that assistance as student accuracy and confidence begins to increase. So going from kind of a most hands-on support for students and then fading that out as students begin to feel more confident in what they're doing. And then item 14, we see that guided practice really should focus on the application of the skills related to the stated goal. So you'll notice a lot of these items continue to kind of come back to this initial goal setting or objective setting. So recognizing that the guided practice that students are being asked to do, it needs to relate directly to kind of the stated goal that the students are working towards for this lesson. So this means that students are actively applying the skills and strategies that were first modeled by the instructor. And then again, that practice is really targeted and focused and in alignment with the goal. So making sure that we're kind of avoiding like unrelated or kind of generalized tasks. All righty. Item 15, we see the teacher providing prompts and cues to support student learning. So this is really where we're looking for reminders of skills or strategies that students are going to need to complete the task successfully. And we also should see kind of an increase in these prompts and cues as we see student participation increasing. So the teacher should be providing more of these prompts and cues as students begin to interact with the material more and more throughout the lesson. And while that's happening, we have item 16 as well here, where the teacher is consistently checking for understanding. And just, I think most importantly here, it's that this check for understanding should be happening throughout the lesson and not just at the end. So we're not just looking for an exit ticket, but we're looking for kind of a continual formative assessment of where students are at throughout this guided practice and independent practice section of the lesson.
And this
Um,
ties into a
yeah,
lot. Sorry, if you said I could speak up anytime. So
and I meant
this ties
it.
into probably what a lot of you guys have heard about opportunities to respond.
Mhm.
So when we're giving students opportunities to respond, that's one way that we keep them engaged in the lesson. Okay, so making sure that you're keeping track of whether they're following you. One thing to think about too is that we're not just asking them if they understand. So if there is a task that we're performing, we need to give an example from them that they can actually perform that task. That's what we mean by understanding in this context. Sorry, Keller.
No apologies. Thank you so much. I appreciate that, Seth. Okay, so item 17. Um, Relatedly, we also want to see the teacher providing timely feedback. So we've done that check for understanding, and then we do something with it, right? And we say, okay, if we see that maybe things are that check for understanding maybe didn't go so great, that we're able to provide timely feedback. So immediate corrective feedback to clarify misunderstandings. Or maybe our check for understanding was perfect and great, and the students all got it, and so we can give some affirmative feedback so that we were reinforcing those accurate responses. And then item 18, we also want to make sure that feedback from the instructor is specific and informative. So making sure we're really providing clear explanations of what went right or maybe what needs to be adjusted so that that way students know what to do with that feedback, right? They can apply it. And then making sure, again, we've said this a lot, we'll continue to say this, that these are also directly aligning to those lesson goals and objectives. So all that feedback really does need to continue to contribute to student learning and help student to improve accuracy in kind of performing that targeted skill. Okay, and then item 19 for guided practice monitoring and feedback is that the teacher adjusts instruction based on student responses. And this it can be a tough one. This is where we're looking for the instructor to make real-time adjustments if they start to see persistent misunderstandings from the students. And this might include having to kind of take a step back and do a little bit of reteaching. So we might see the teacher do a little bit of remodeling or going back, adding back in some additional scaffolds that they had previously removed. And this is, again, kind of in direct response to what we see when we do those checks for understanding. So if the teacher is starting to recognize that there are persistent, misunderstandings or things the students are confused by, that the teacher takes that opportunity to pause and kind of rewind a little bit and do a little bit of reteaching and clarifying. So some tips for observing these items. Um, it's going to be important to consider, and we talked about this a bit, but considering not only the behavior of the instructor, so what's happening that the instructor's saying and doing, but also what the students are doing. And so thinking a little bit about what the students are up to, as well as, again, that alignment piece. And so this is where kind of Seth's tip earlier about maybe jotting down that goal at the very beginning of the lesson would come in really handy. Because if we're observing a full 45-minute lesson here, and we're continuing to come back to that objective or goal that was stated in the first 5 minutes, it might be handy to kind of have that for you as you're observing, to make sure that everything that's coming up in this guided practice section is still in alignment with those goals. Um, it also may be important to observe the lesson from multiple vantage points. And this is, again, to think a little bit about what the students are doing and get the opportunity to see what the students are producing in terms of what they're practicing, what's coming back on those checks for understanding, so we can see if those real-time adjustments are needed. Each key indicator of guided practice could look a little bit different depending upon what is explicitly taught. So this can be really tricky because it might not look the same every time. And so just considering kind of the complexity of the skill that we're asking students to complete, thinking about the sequencing of the lesson, all of those things are going to be really important when we're conducting observations, because maybe this is part one of like a three-part task we're asking students to do over multiple days. And so that is going to change the way that an observer is sort of looking to see the level of implementation for some of these items. So that can be pretty tricky, but just kind of making sure you have the full picture here, communicating with that instructor, talking with them and getting an understanding of what's going on in this lesson before you go in, after you go in to do this observation. All of those things can really help with this. Um, and then last thing here, and we're going to talk about opportunities to respond again in the next section as well. But just noticing that when we're thinking about some of those opportunities to respond, we might see less of them at the kind of towards the beginning of this guided practice section. If the teacher's doing a lot of kind of modeling or self-talk or still providing a lot of those scaffolds at the beginning, we might see kind of less of those opportunities to respond. However, we're going to get to that in our next section here, where we talk about pacing and engagement. And this is our last component for the rubric we're going to go through. So when we're talking about pacing, we are talking about the overall flow and timing of the lesson. And this really refers to how the teacher is managing the speed of instruction. which sounds really like no big deal. But if I know as a former teacher, this was honestly one of the things I struggled with the most. So I'm not sure about y'all, but pacing can be a really, really tricky thing. Engagement describes the degree to which students are active participants in their learning. And so this section really reflects kind of how the teacher is both monitoring and facilitating student involvement in the lesson. All right, so these are our last 5 items. Item 20 is that the teacher maintains an appropriate pace throughout the lesson. So this means that instructional time is used efficiently while allowing students adequate opportunities to engage with the content. We often hear like appropriate but brisk, or like brisk but appropriate. So knowing that there's always a lot to get done in a short amount of time in a classroom, keeping up a brisk pace, but also recognizing that just delivering all of the content does not mean necessarily that the students are going to get the opportunity to engage in that content. So brisk, but still appropriate, and making sure we're providing those opportunities for students to really engage in their learning. Um, when we're talking about pacing, we're also thinking about wait time. So allowing adequate time for students to think or respond throughout the lesson. And the amount of wait time kind of depends. It needs to align with the complexity of the task that we're asking students to complete. But I think this is a good time to just say out loud that speed alone is not an indicator of effective instruction. So if we're not providing adequate wait time, if we're not giving students time and space, again, to be able to really engage with the materials, both internally and also externally, having those opportunities to respond, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're kind of pioneering effective instruction because we got through all the material we need to get through in 45 minutes. So just making sure that we're building in those spaces again for wait time and opportunities for students to respond. And speaking of opportunities to respond, we're almost there. So item 22 is again that the teacher maintains focus on the stated or implied goal throughout the lesson. So again, we are really trying to make sure we're meeting these goals. And this plays into pacing because, again, former teacher here, really easy to get off on unnecessary tangents. Really, really easy to get distracted as the instructor. And so when we're observing explicit instruction, that is one of the things that we're looking for, is that the instruction is staying focused on that goal and not kind of getting off on other tasks or skills. And then item 23, again, we've hinted at this a lot, but really providing those frequent opportunities for students to engage or respond during the lesson. So this might be verbal, written, or physical responses, even something as easy as like thumbs up if you understand, or give me a ranking on your hands. How comfortable do you feel with this information? One, two, or three? Um, Written as well as verbal responses are all opportunities that we can provide to the students to really, again, engage in that content or that task. And you can also allow students to rehearse new skills and provide ongoing kind of feedback on student understanding. Um, yeah. Okay. Two more. Item 24. We want to make sure there are structured and predictable instructional routines throughout the lesson. So this is, the ways in which students know to pass out papers, down the rows. These are routines around how students get up and get their materials, the things that they are used to doing in their classroom that help to really keep things moving really efficiently. So this really supports that pacing. When students have routines, they know how things go. They're able to move from one task to the next quickly. And so these established routines really reduce disruptions and, again, allow for more kind of effective instructional time. And then item 25, the teacher is monitoring students to ensure that they remain engaged. So again, we're seeing the teacher circulate around the room, observe student responses, check work in progress. And what this does is this ensures that students, one, remain on task, but also two, helps kind of play into what we talked about a little bit ago about real-time adjustments. Because if the teacher is able to walk around, see what the students are doing, see what they're writing down on their papers, then the teacher is able to do those kind of ongoing formative assessments and make adjustments as needed during the lesson. Okay, so those are our 25 items. Tips for observing this last section on pacing and engagement. One, we're going to kind of adequately think about pacing and engagement, it's important to think about the entirety of the lesson. Um, Engagement really involve attending to all students who are participating in instruction. So again, making sure that we are circulating, we are trying to observe the whole class as well as the instructor. And then keeping kind of engagement in mind while thinking about others. So something like monitoring to ensure that all students are responding as intended during instruction. So those checks for understanding, if it's thumbs up if you understand, puts their thumb up, then that's also engagement thing to think about, not just that but also that the students are engaging with it. And so it may be that some of those final determinations in terms of level of implementation need to be decided after the lesson has concluded. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more broadly about implementation, kind of variation, and how to sort of train for this rubric. So each component of our explicit instruction rubric here is equal to the rubric that was developed by Johnson and Colleagues that Seth talked about earlier. So all the items are the same. We just did a little bit of rearranging to try to support usability for classrooms. Going the 7 components, we've kind of condensed them down into 4. But all of the items have stayed the same to support the validity of the rubric. The rubric can be used by school-based personnel to observe, monitor, and coach teachers that are implementing explicit instructional practices. And so I'm going to take a second here to show you kind of what the rubric looks like in our online Measure First tool here at the end. So if you'll just sort of stick with me, we'll go through that at the very end, but I'll show you how we've taken the rubric and we've actually put it into a tool that you can use and fill out while you're conducting a classroom observation. So we'll look at that in just a second. Okay, so monitoring the implementation of explicit instruction may help to support teacher development and subsequently improve student literacy outcomes, because we know that if explicit instruction is implemented with fidelity, that we see improvements in student outcomes. So by monitoring that implementation, observing teachers as they implement explicit instruction, we're working together to support those student literacy outcomes. It is important that we provide a little bit of a research caveat here, which is we do want to note that most of the research on this rubric has been conducted within special education classrooms. And so with that being kind of said and kept in mind, it may be that there needs to be a little bit of variation in how the rubric is used within your context and within your school, and thinking a little bit about how that looks within the tier 1 instruction that's happening in your schools. And we're going to talk about that a tiny bit more. So what kind of variations are we talking about here? Well, 2 possible things to consider. I'm sure there's more, but here's 2 at least. One is thinking about how this rubric and explicit instruction might align with the curricula that is being used in your schools. So perhaps you have a curriculum that has its own fidelity observation form. And so as the instructional coach, you're like, well, wait a minute, which one do I use? How do I decide what fidelity to monitor here? And so it's really important to kind of be transparent and open about that and have some conversations with other educators, coaches, your leadership team, and really stop and kind of take a step back and think a little bit about key components. What are the key components with the curriculum that you're using? What are the key components of this explicit instruction rubric that you want to zero in on? And ways that you can kind of perhaps use this explicit instruction rubric as a supplement, as opposed to something that is kind of competing with what's happening in your classrooms. And that can be a tall order, but something that I think is important to discuss. And then the other thing to think about might be group size. So explicit instruction can look really different depending upon the group size that you're working within. So a whole group explicit instruction lesson might look different than small group, might look different than one-on-one. This may impact things like pacing, number of feedback opportunities, full group participation. So keeping those things in mind when we're thinking about what full implementation really looks like. And again, being transparent, I think, and having those conversations about what we want that to look like within our specific context is important. Okay. So what about training someone to use this? So if you were getting ready to observe someone and you wanted to use this explicit instruction rubric, some things we might recommend that you do beforehand. One is to spend some time with this rubric before you do observations and make sure you feel really comfortable with it before you go in and start observing teachers, just so that that way it is a valuable use of everyone's time. So making sure you're really familiar with the rubric and also really familiar with explicit instruction and what those components really can look like in action. One thing we might recommend, if you feel so inclined, is to complete the IRRC's Foundations of Fidelity e-learning module, which goes through kind of the basics of just Fidelity observations in general, and talks a little bit more about kind of best practices for conducting observations as a whole. So we do offer that if you are interested. Um, Training on this rubric really should be conducted across multiple days and in smaller chunks, which is not what we're doing with you all this afternoon. So sorry about that. This is kind of the 30,000-foot aerial view of the rubric. But when you're getting ready to use it in a classroom, I think really breaking it down into smaller bites and spending some time with individual sections is really key and really critical. So you can really start to know that rubric backwards and forwards before you go in and observe a lesson. Some ways that you might spend some time with this rubric might include watching some video examples, which we do have online in our e-learning module. Maybe doing some role playing, so getting together with other, instructional coaches and having someone get up and teach a lesson and practice scoring them, and then maybe swapping roles. Also, maybe starting your observations with veteran teachers, with teachers who feel really comfortable having people in their room observing and feel really comfortable with explicit instruction as a way to kind of get started getting comfortable with using this rubric in classrooms. And then what about training for teachers? It's important that teachers receive extensive training and ongoing support in explicit instruction. If we're going to observe our teachers in explicit instruction and ask them to fully implement explicit instruction, then they need to be fully trained in explicit instruction. So making sure that they have that support up front before we're conducting those observations. Explicit instruction, as you've seen, we've got 25 items. It's got a lot of components. And so it might be helpful to chunk this. It might be helpful for teachers who are new to explicit instruction that maybe you come in and you're only observing goals and alignment. You only come in for 10 or 15 minutes of a 45-minute lesson and you just look at the teaching procedures and kind of break it into smaller bites and spend some time and some coaching, giving feedback to the teacher on different components of the rubric, as opposed to kind of coming in and doing the whole thing every time. In some ways, that's not the most feasible. And also, I think can be really overwhelming for teachers who are getting comfortable with explicit instruction. So yeah, observers may work with teachers on one dimension of the rubric at a time, and then again, going through those cycles of coaching and feedback before moving on to the next dimension. Okay, some final thoughts. We know that fidelity sometimes can be something that can be pretty intimidating and sometimes a little bit overwhelming and occasionally can feel evaluative. And so we just want to conclude this portion, at least, of this webinar by saying that it's really important that these fidelity observations, they're built into a more kind of collaborative and supportive culture around fidelity and helping to make sure that teachers instructional coaches, administrators, that everybody's on the same page that these are formative and supportive evaluations, that they are not designed to be evaluative, and that these are an ongoing collaborative process that everyone engages in to support student literacy outcomes. And so just making sure that if we have that culture around fidelity, that we can support our teachers as we kind of engage in this explicit instruction work. Seth, I see you've unmuted.
Yes, yes. So I'm not going to take you by complete surprise this time. One other thing I want to add is also this idea that if you followed us through all those items, you'll note that a lot of them really depended on what the teacher was doing that day and who who the students they were working with were and what their needs are. Okay, so you can't just go in and observe blind. So it really does need a process where, like, I'm watching you do this, but I'm also trying to understand more about what you're doing and who you're working with, and sort of making that sort of getting that understanding in an ongoing fashion really can make this feel more constructive.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. So I see we have about 15 minutes, a little less. I do want to just take a second. Hopefully my screen sharing is going to cooperate here. Can you see the Measure First website, Seth? Great. Okay, perfect. So just want to take you to the rubric itself that we have posted and available online for you. So if you're on the Iowa Reading Research Center website, you go to Resources, Apps and Tools, and then Measure First, Fidelity. Both the foundations of Fidelity materials, as well as everything we've covered today, can be found here. So if you scroll down, you'll see we are advertising the new explicit instruction information, as well as a lot of other materials that are here for thinking about kind of what Measure First is, what Fidelity is, why does it matter, etc. But if you scroll down a little bit further, you will get to our tool. Oh, I'm going to have to log in. Okay. And so when you come to the tool here, this is actually our observation rubric tool. And so if you create an account with us, what you can do is have access to some pre-made rubrics that we have provided for you, including this explicit instruction rubric, as well as a couple of others. And we're going to continue to work on this. And you're also able to build your own Fidelity observation rubric. So you're welcome to go through and create your own based on whatever needs you have in your school context. I am going to log in, but it's going to take me half a second. Seth, do you have anything you want to add while I work on logging in?
No, and well, I do have something to add because I'm not going to leave you hanging there. So when you're using this tool, again, you can sort of make it very customizable to what you're reading about, or what you're working on. But there are sort of, again, a lot of different considerations about what you're measuring. And again, if you're measuring someone else, you want to make sure that they know what you're going to be measuring. Again, this is about making sure that they know that their success is your success and vice versa as a trainer and as someone who's teaching. Still not in, huh?
Thank you. Yes.
Mhm.
No, we are up. Okay, so you
Oh,
can come
fantastic.
to forms here, and you will see that there's a list of IRRC forms. So measuring opportunities to respond, Lifter and Clifter, which are our handwriting curricula. There are fidelity forms for that, and then that explicit instruction fidelity rubric. But then there's also a place for you to build your own forms. That's a different webinar for a different day. But I do just want to show you quickly. So everything we talked about today is embedded within this explicit instruction fidelity rubric. And you could pull this up and use this while you're conducting observations in a classroom. So that is the Measure First tool. Okay, with 10 minutes here, I am going to stop sharing. Oh, you know what? No, I'm not, because we need to talk about just a couple more quick things, which is one, if you would like to learn more or have questions for our team specifically, please reach out and contact the IRRC. We provide both email and live support. So we do office hour consultations. We'll hop on Zoom with you for half an hour and chat about whatever you've got kind of going on literacy wise that we can help with. So please reach out and contact us if you have literacy questions or concerns that we can support. Um, we also have the Iowa Science of Reading Summit coming up. Registration is officially open. It is so much fun. We would love to have you join us this summer in Cedar Rapids, where we talk about all things science of reading. Um, if you are not tired of listening to me talk yet, I am doing another webinar next month on cursive handwriting instruction. So if that's something else you're interested in, please join me. And then we also have down here in April, we are going to have a secondary instruction focused webinar on morphology coming up. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen. And Kate and Nikki, maybe we can look at some questions. If you have any questions you would like to submit in the chat, please feel free to do so as well. Ah, do we have any questions?
I
Yes,
don't.
sorry. We do have questions. I
Mhm.
apologies, thought maybe you had the doc open. So first, group of question we had was, how might we incorporate inquiry into this process? For example, in section about the relevance of the goal, would a teacher need to explicitly state the relevance, or can questioning and other techniques be used to support students to arrive at the relevance, as opposed to telling them why it's relevant initially?
Oh, you're telling me to answer this. Oh, yeah. So, no, actually, I think that that's a wonderful way to sort of combine when we talk about activating background knowledge um, with the idea of stating the relevance of the goal. Okay. And there are a lot of issues, I think, where that's going to be really apparent to students. It might automatically resonate with them why what you're working on matters to them. One of the reasons of why we include this, though, is that there are a lot of things that we ask students to do that because they're students, because they're new learners, they don't necessarily appreciate why that's going to be important. So again, we do feel that this procedure, there is a lot of latitude in terms of when and how you do certain things, which is why one of the reasons we ask observers to be familiar with the lesson and the needs of the students before they observe.
Yeah, totally. I think just to build on that, yeah. So incorporating that inquiry piece, maybe at the very top of the lesson to not only activate background knowledge, but then also sort of work together to come to that goal of, what that real world application is. As long as I think that goal is still explicitly stated and that relevance is explicitly stated, kind of prior to diving in to the material for the day. So doing that together, I think, and facilitating, leading your students towards the answer that you kind of want them to get to, I think is absolutely a great way to get students excited and interested in what they're going to be learning for the day.
All right. Well, the next question would be, can you provide specific examples of check for understanding and timely feedback?
Sure. So, and one of the things that we want to point out is that while we were talking over this can sort of feel very abstract. If you look on some of our blog posts, for example, when we talk about specific techniques, almost all of them reference explicit instruction. So, one way of doing it, Keller mentioned a few, but one way might be, how are we doing? Do we understand this three, like one, two, three? But again, if you want to do something more specific, one way is to give students a whiteboard and to respond to a query or problem, and then have them raise that very quickly to sort of demonstrate an answer, giving them tasks that they could perform so you could quickly see that they are, in fact, learning what they're supposed to be picking up from the lesson.
One question we had was, what group size is the research based on?
Seth, I'm going to leave that one with you too, actually, if that's okay.
Okay, so it really just depends on what research you're talking about. So if you're talking about the research for the rubric, it was extensively tested in tier 2 and tier 3 environments. And so what that means is that there is smaller groups. There's also some one-to-one type thing. If you're talking about explicit instruction, there is a lot of research, both on explicit instruction explicitly, as well as interventions that are grounded in explicit instruction. These range from whole group to one-on-one. And again, I want to refer you again to our blog. So I have a post on
Hmm.
explicit instruction, and some of the links to that actually are to resources related to reviews of the history of sort of explicit instruction and its comparison to other methods and the learners for whom it is most suitable. And one thing I want to point out is when we're talking, I think I want to go back to that question because it's really important to note that in general, your instruction is going to be on a continuum. You're going to have a lot of structure sometimes, you're going to have a little structure sometimes, and it's really just about what your learners need. But that being said, when we're talking about students who frequently and tasks which we can predict students are going to struggle, I think it's probably best to start out with this level of support and then draw that back as it's clear they don't need it, rather than to start out really from just no support at all or limited support and then introduce it once you realize that, oh, that my students need more support. It's generally more efficient, and I think the research supports this idea of starting with explicit instruction.
It's a great answer, Seth. And yeah, I will just also say we do in the e-learning module that goes through all of this material in quite a bit more depth. We do also reference several other research studies that implement explicit instruction embedded within other literacy interventions. And so there's a lot of information you can find on those within our e-learning module as well.
Kind of tied with that, you mentioned explicit instruction within the context of Fidelity. So if we were to teach with Fidelity, what's the best group size?
Hmm. Well, I think ideally we can implement explicit instruction with Fidelity at any group size, whole group, small group, one-on-one. I think the what those might look like. So as an observer, your kind of look fors might change a bit in terms of implementing explicit instruction with Fidelity. But as far as following these Fidelity rubric items, I think these absolutely can be implemented at any group size. Seth, anything you want to add?
Well, and I just want to also note that again, we're talking about sort of principles of instructional design. And I think
Yeah.
when we talk about group size, one of the things we're getting at is in terms of feasibility. When we get into this idea of sometimes we're asked to do things that are more or less not feasible. So, for example, if one teacher with 50 students, all of whom require intensive reading supports, and you have 30 minutes to do that, you're not going to see a lot of fidelity there because you're being asked to do something that isn't really appropriate. So, if you're in that kind of situation, that context needs to be taken into account, and hopefully,
Mhm.
those contexts that's why we have hopefully time structured in for things like tier two, where if we have where we can get smaller groups. But that being said, regardless of the group size, there are a lot of tenets that we went over today that you could incorporate. So it is possible to state your goal. With 10 people, it's possible to do that with 100 people and so forth. And a lot of things that are related to that. I hope that answered your question. Good question.
Yeah, I thought that was great, Seth. And just one more thing, I know we're coming up on time, but I think that that spurred me a little bit in thinking about coming back to once more this idea of a collaborative nature of fidelity observations. And so, if that group size, trying to do all of the things, honoring all of the tenets of explicit instruction is not feeling feasible to you as the instructor, that is hopefully an opportunity for you to get to engage in some of that collaborative problem solving with your lit leadership team, because that's kind of the two-way street of fidelity observations as they are intended, which is that if there are things that aren't feasible and aren't working, that you're able to go back to the drawing board and figure out how to make it work specifically within your context.
Mhm. And we have a good blog post on that, by the way. So if
We
you're falling down,
do.
yeah, we have a blog post on contextual fit. So again, that is a conversation and negotiation that has to happen between both the people implementing instruction and their observers.
All right,
Awesome.
well, we are at time. And so do you just want to plug one more time, maybe if folks still have questions or additional questions, how they can get a hold of you?
Sure, absolutely. We can put emails in the chat, but you are also welcome to submit a request in our contact us form. That might be another great way to do that. I don't mean to put anybody on the spot, but Kate, if by any chance you have quick access to that and you want to throw that in the chat as well. So the IRC contact us form is a great way. I'll throw my email in and Seth can throw his in as well. We want to thank you so much for your time this afternoon and hope you have a great evening.
Thank you all for coming.